Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with the aBlogtoWatch Superlative Podcast. My guests today are the co-founders of Vaer Watches, Ryan Torres and Reagan Cook. Ryan and Reagan, welcome.
Thank you. We're really excited to be here.
So I've known about the Vaer brand. Ryan, you also grew up like a few blocks away from where I live now. And you're a California, Los Angeles-based watchmaker, sort of surfing inspired. We met for the first time recently at the Intersect Watch Show. I guess my first question is, how did you end up being an exhibitor at the Intersect Watch Show?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, it was awesome to meet you in person for the first time. We're big fans of aBlogtoWatch, of course.
Thank you.
We had a great conversation there. But we came across Intersect, I guess initially, we were attending Windup, first as fans and then as attendees. And through those watch fairs, we were able to link up with other brands. Some of the best part about getting to go to these watch fairs is not only meeting customers, but getting to meet other brands and brand owners. We befriended Wes from Notice over the years, amongst many other brand owners. And he pitched us on this Intersect show. So we got to attend our first one last year, and then second one this year. And as Reagan said, when we spoke earlier, we were super enthusiastic about it. There's so much focus on the microbrands there, and really get a lot of good time with brand owners who we've had great relationships with. And then, of course, it's always a pleasure getting to go to a show close to your own hometown. Long Beach is only like 40 minutes from where we live. So it was just a pleasure to get to go to Intersect this year.
These types of shows are really popular now, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere. These opportunities to connect, not just meet with consumers, but also other watch brand professionals is really, really attractive. For those people that don't sort of quite get it, talk a little bit about the pitch. When someone is trying to pitch you on going to these things, what are they sort of saying? Because I think it's very common for people as I guess you could say as fans, watch buyers, guests going to these shows. But from the exhibitor perspective, I think there's less sort of understanding. Talk about why these are a big deal and how they're pitched to you.
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. I mean, we don't have a wide range of experience. We're not by any means experts in the fairs. Like essentially, as a relatively young company, we have the experience, as Ryan mentioned, going to the Worn & Wound's Wind-Up Watch Fair. We've been to, I believe, 4 of those over the years, and we've now been to 2 of the Intersect shows. So, I mean, that's our only experience. Obviously, in the case of Intersect, we're friends with Wes, and we like everything that the guys at Notice and those other brands are doing. So we just wanted to kind of show our support as he's trying to take on a new initiative, which we're kind of keen on. For the Wind-Up show, which for us is a US-based microbrand, especially in the early days as we're trying to establish our name and get the word out there, I think it was kind of it seemed like the Cool Kids Club or the in-group. And so as a small brand, I think there's a lot of appeal to go to your first show. Is like you maybe have made it to some extent as a micro brand if you're able to go and show at a wind-up show or be invited. So that's definitely how we felt maybe back in our first show at 2019. Obviously, as we've done several of them, and then you get more experienced, and you also realize there's costs. It is fun, but there's also a lot of costs associated. I think that also starts to become a balance of, okay, do we do, and I think in the case of Windup, they do 3 shows a year. How can we rationalize them? So I think last year we did 2 shows, San Francisco and New York. This year we decided to only do 1. So there's a little bit of the financial incentive and just trying to figure out, hey, how much is this going to cost, the logistics? As a small company, and I think a lot of the big brands that are exhibiting there are small companies, it is a big disruption. Even for us, we're only flying 5 hours to New York, 6 hours to New York. But for I guess Ryan dropped off. For there's a lot of European brands too, so that kind of puts in perspective. A lot of companies are willing to fly across the Atlantic to be there, so it's the least we could do to show up, and that's something that we try to create a tradition of, I suppose.
I think what's so interesting is that initially you don't really know what to make of it. You're like, oh, other brands like mine are going. I have colleagues that are saying you should participate, but it's an unknown. And it isn't until you go to maybe more than one of them after you've seen how much energy it takes, how much money it takes, and then you sort of have to gauge, did this do something for me? And I think that's so interesting about the watch industry in general is that when it comes to any kind of spending or investing, whether it's new product, marketing, going to an event, it's very difficult to know in advance what it's going to do for you. You sort of look to the side, you're like, brands like mine are doing it, or people I like are recommending that I do it. But ultimately, I guess through all marketing, you never know until you try it. Would you agree or disagree?
I would agree. I mean, and I don't know if this is a controversial opinion, but in the case of Windup, I would, as much as it was expensive when we did it in 2019, it was $3,000 to exhibit. I believe now we're paying $9,000. I don't know if there's lower tier packages, but that's a lot of money. If you're a startup brand, you're making, maybe you're doing $100,000, $200,000 a year of your watch startup, your side hustle. I would just advise be very, very careful before spending $10,000 on a watch fair. Because if you're going to spend $10,000, assume that you're not going to make any sales and be okay with that. And any sale you do make, that's good. But also assume that you're going to have to pay for travel, accommodation, et cetera, et cetera. If you can think of that $10,000 spend rather than, hey, I need to make that back in $10,000 of sales at the show, think of it as a $10,000 investment in, hey, getting to meet brands that are that next phase, getting to meet with people who are, maybe doing better in terms of manufacturing a supply chain as you. That's a $10,000 investment in growing your brand and meeting and networking, meeting people like yourself, Ariel, and the wider watch world and the press and everything. I think those things are great, but I would also caution that for that ROI, it can be really tough, and especially for those smaller brands.
Yeah, to that point, we started when we went into it, as Reagan said, we were excited just to be with the big dogs. But we also went into it thinking, we're going to sell, it's all about selling watches. It's all about selling watches, the first 2 or 3 shows. And now we don't even sell watches at the shows. Now it's shifted from, okay, we're going to sell watches to, no, we're going to spend time. We're going to meet our customers in person. A lot of microbrands don't have stores and aren't in retail. That's a huge gap for brands like us. And so getting to meet our customers in person, see which watches they pick up on the table and what they wear and what they have to say is huge. And then, as Reagan alluded to, we're having this conversation, getting to be on aBlogtoWatch podcast because we participated in Intersect. And that's a pretty big deal. So those connections are invaluable. And then I guess what I get most excited about is going back to hanging out with the other brand owners. There's such a group of very cool, good people. So we always get to have good conversations as friends, and we get to share with each other best practices, manufacturing, what we're paying for things, and what's working for us. And those are the really huge learnings that, go way beyond just being able to sell watches in person.
Yeah, just to add on that, just to add one more piece is I think as a watch owner brand, whatever stage you're at, you look at from outside looking in, you're like, wow, that brand is so perfect. They're doing so well. They have and then you go and, Windup is we're exhausted, but then you go out, out at night, go do karaoke and you're meeting and greeting with your quote unquote competitors, but then everyone's just sharing the struggles, the challenges, that thing almost made us go out of business. And it's we're not the only ones who are, hitting hard. Those parts of struggle can be very lonely as a small company. And it's great to commiserate and share the struggles with people trying to do it the same. It kind of makes it feel like a community, which it is.
I'm going to hit on that issue again, but I wanted to talk about something you mentioned that I was thinking about, which I think is really important. And that is I guess I call it the level of competitiveness at the show. And what I noticed is that, especially compared to several years ago when I went to sort of similar events, the quality of stuff is pretty good. If you walk around Intersect or Windup, actually I haven't been to Windup recently, but Intersect, and yes, not everything's for everyone, but everything's pretty refined. Everything's pretty confident. There isn't a lot of super amateur stuff. Years ago, I would have gone to places where there had been someone who's very bright-eyed and very excited, but no one has the heart to say dude, you do not know how to design watches, or this is not made well. But things were generally very, very good. If you were, your average watch lover with a lot of experience or even a novice, you could probably go to Intersect and find something that not only you liked, that was your budget, and that you wouldn't have to be embarrassed about ever showing to someone because it was, relatively well done. So I think that that's an interesting thing. Would you agree that especially when it just comes to basic competitiveness, everything at the show is pretty good? Yeah, absolutely. I would say when we started Windup 3 years ago, we felt towards the bottom of the barrel. So it's inspired us to improve our designs over time. We see everyone
it's just so impressive how good microbrand watches are. You know, Greg and I talk all the time. You can go to a Swiss luxury boutique and be really unimpressed compared to the watches you're seeing at Windup or at Intersect. You know, these events house brands that care so much and are so meticulous with everything from components to fit and finish that the bar just gets, I feel like, raised each time with, you know, the cost of a watch still being, you know, under $1,000 for many brands. It's really, really impressive.
Yeah, for me, I enjoy, like, I feel probably the same way as you felt just walking around Intersect, and same with Windup, which is, I guess, bigger, is that we are usually focused on the brands that we see as our contemporaries, the ones that were started around the same time or that we think are bigger than us or what have you. That's what we spend a lot of our focus on because we're always kind of looking outward. Those shows are an opportunity for us because we're not really paying that much attention on the day-to-day of like the small startups, but it's great. And I could say the same with Intersect. There were watches of brands I'd never heard of that I was like, wow, like to enter the space today is harder than it was 5 or 10 years ago because everyone is further along. So therefore, to stand out and actually have a piece of the market, you do have to execute on design. And I mean, not obviously not every single exhibitor it's going to not work. It's not always going to work, but many of the watches I see of these new brands, I'm like, wow, they're raising the bar. So there's a lot of inspiration pulling from, the first exhibitors as much as the kind of the established bigger names.
I think what's interesting is that as a company, you always have to keep improving. You always have to keep refining, but you always need inspiration to do so. And so what you're saying is the most obvious thing to do is, like you said, look at brands that started around the same time as you, maybe are a similar price point, maybe are run by similar people. But these days, even though the timepiece industry is literally hundreds of years old, there aren't really like established business models. You just sort of have to be a bit of like a pioneer where you like look out into the frontier and be like, that person seems to have a successful homestead. Maybe I'll copy their layout and also be successful. They're not going to tell you whether or not to do that, even if you're really good buddies with them sometimes. But there's this idea where you know you can find success, but it's very difficult to know yourself what to do as an entrepreneur, right?
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, I think there are, I mean, as I was kind of alluding to, where there's kind of the shop talk, which happens kind of the after hours. It's where, and that's my pitch to other brand owners is like to be in those conversations is fun because of course it's positive, but there's also people talking smack about the brands that aren't there about what they're doing, or, you know, oh, you think they're doing well, they're struggling, this, that. So there's, you kind of, you're completely right, Earl. There's no like blueprint or playbook for a brand to get from, I mean, there's a playbook to get from, say, $1 million in revenue to $50 million in revenue as a watch microbrand, and you're trying to do it at a low margin, which means you're delivering high value to your customers. That playbook doesn't exist. I mean, we're all trying. All the brands that are aspiring to make that leap are trying to figure out the playbook, but it's anyone's guess as to how that's actually going to fall together and who's going to be the first brand to get there, and whether that's even a realistic goal. We have a dream, but maybe it's $50 million, maybe it's $100 million, maybe it's lower than that. Who knows? But yeah, and then of course you look at the brands that are bigger than that, which we don't call microbrands, which are essentially the established players, and they operate a very, very different business model where you essentially see, like in a case of Omega, all over the Olympics, or Rolex all over, you know, sporting events, what have you.
If you had the chance to talk to some of the established brand managers, owners, whatnot, you know, I'm talking about the big old names and things like that, to be curious about that, what kind of questions did you ask them? Because A, there aren't a lot of forums for you to even go and like see them speak, or maybe, you know, like corner them and be like, sir, ma'am, I'd like to have a question. And B, they're not really known for telling those things. But I think what's so interesting is that as a newer brand in sort of what we call the microbrand space, the enthusiast-driven space, you look sometimes enviously, sometimes humorously at the established industry, and you wonder a lot, why do they do it that way? How did they do this? What are some of the questions that you guys would ask some of the sort of like more accomplished veterans of the industry that is a little bit more on the legacy side?
Well, just to clarify, what would you, in your view, when you ask that question, who do you see? What would you see as that? Like, what brand? I'm just curious.
I mean, you mentioned Omega, for example. That's an example of an older brand.
Top dogs. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Which basically, like, because it's interesting because the watch industry is extremely fragmented. There's thousands of watch brands, but there's like 5 or 6 that are over $1 billion in revenue. So it's kind of like the really, really big brands, which are obviously mostly conglomerates. Oh, but yeah, okay, fair enough. That's a great question.
I personally, I'm always so curious about cost of components. Like their markups are obviously insane. So if I could get unlimited answers from some of these execs, that is straight where I would go. I'm so curious how much it costs to manufacture a Rolex case, or how much, Tudor's paying for their dials. And all of those pieces to me are what I'm most curious about, having, going on 8 years now, trying to build our own watches, seeing one, how much their components cost, and then two, how in the world they're able to influence people to pay, in a lot of cases, such a high markup to buy those watches. That's always, I'm always enamored with just, again, figuring out how maybe their costs are higher than I expect, or maybe they're low because of, scale or a variety of factors, but that intrigues me to a high extent.
Very valuable information. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I would tend to say the same thing. I mean, I think what is, because these companies are such a light years away where any microbrand is today. What's unique, what I would probably be most interested in finding, even as opposed to that, which I don't think there's very many people like this, but who is this sole individual that has taken a brand from zero to what is the biggest today? And I don't know who that person is, but because essentially all of these legacy brands are like family traditions are, 100 years plus old. So it's hard to take someone who has the benefit of microbrands is that me and Ryan understand every aspect of our business, from manufacturing to marketing to customer support to logistics, all of those types of little details, which creates a lot of product expertise across the scope of the business. When you get into a brand like Omega, like as Ryan said, he'd probably be speaking to a product VP, right? But that person would know the supply chain intimately, but they would know literally nothing about the marketing of Omega. So it's kind of interesting how I would probably want to have a chat with someone. I don't know what that person would be, but the person who's taken it from 0 to 100 million and operates with extreme perspective, because it's that growth cycle that creates that kind of founder story. And a lot of those people that was the way watches kind of established themselves probably in the first half of the 20th century, a lot of these kind of founder owner stories.
That's so interesting, because I'm thinking about it now and I'm realizing there's not a lot of people, if any, left alive to ask that too. What you have is these historic success stories of these personalities that started a brand, but later it was taken on by a group or a team or some other owner. And then you have stories of people today who rescued a fledgling or failing brand that they didn't start, but they helped fix, like someone like a Jean-Claude Biver who's done with like Hublot or Blancpain or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I think that the type of person you're talking about actually in a lot of ways has the cards stacked against them, because what you have is the ability for one person with vision to start a creative company. But they always have a ceiling that they don't see. But at some point, they have to hand off responsibility of key tasks like marketing or running operations to someone else. And frequently, control needs to be arrested away from them so that other people can handle those other tasks. They tend to be so consumed by the desire for control, which isn't a good or bad thing, it's just a thing, that they don't realize their own limitations. And so that type of person who can start something from scratch, but successfully attract enough other talent to handle key duties that they themselves aren't good at. I'm not saying there's no examples right now, but I can't think of any off the top of my head that would be like really wow examples. You just have this interesting experience where different personalities over different times there's one individual in the past that was amazing with design, but everyone says, oh, he was a terrible businessman, right? And then someone comes later who's amazing with marketing, who hates being in a factory, but loves selling or getting people excited about stuff. So likes being charismatic or sharing stories, but themselves is not an engineer or designer. And then you have that. And so you have these strong, effervescent personalities that tend to not work well in teams, but ultimately by themselves can't do everything. And I wanted to know if you noticed that or if you've seen exceptions to that. Because me, professionally, that's what I've sort of seen during my lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, my insight on that is that, again, this kind of ties back to the bigger discussion, is there's kind of a gap in the market for American companies. If there are innovative leaders, they're probably European or possibly Japanese. Essentially the biggest American watch brands are the least inspiring, in the market in many cases, because they're like legacy budget, fashion brands. There's no American Steve Jobs in the watch industry, and it's strange because how large the U.S. watch market is. It seems strange that the most entrepreneurial country in the world has yet to produce someone to figure out how to use the spirit of kind of American startup culture to create something that is inspiring and has that founder story.
Can I comment on that?
Of course, yeah.
You're not wrong in the modern sense, but in my study of the watch industry historically, what I found was that during a period of time, and this was in the 19th century, the United States was that environment for watches.
Agreed. I studied it as well. Yeah. Waltham, Elgin, 100%. Yeah.
But when you really read into it more, you see that there was tons of companies. And one of the things that empowered all that was the manufacturing here in the United States. Mm-hmm, when they had the ability to walk to the factory or shake hands with the person who's a supplier, you could do those things, which is why the Swiss get away with as much as they do, is because they could literally drive and bring fruit and treats to a watch factory and be like, please make my cases better. The Swiss were very, very threatened by the United States and have not forgotten today, even it's 100 years later, that America really pulled the rug out from underneath it. And it forced the Swiss to change a lot of things, bring in, assembly lines and all kinds of things like that they never really did. So it was actually good for the Swiss watchmakers competition, but America did do that. Today, you see this sort of vestiges of this a little bit, but we lack that industrial base here, as we do with many things, right? We still have it for cars, but that's the biggest complaint now, of course, in American politics is we want to have all these homegrown industries, but we sent them overseas long ago. And watchmaking was one of the first things that American watch companies outsourced. Timex was one of the first when they were able to open up a plant in the Philippines. They're like, this thing takes a lot of time and effort. There's lower labor costs over here. Let's do it here. So we have this strange situation where we're bringing back something that we let go of a long time ago while still trying to make a business proposition out of it and asking ourselves, does the world need these things? We know the world needs solar panels if we ever wanted to make those, or batteries. More watches, it's hard to make a convincing argument to a sober-minded business person of yes, in 10 years, people are going to still need these things. A financier never understands people will emotionally want this in 10 years. That doesn't make sense to them. That you can't show that on paper. But I'm just trying to explain some of the context, which I think is relevant in setting the field as it is right now. Because Americans recognize people want watches and it's good business and it's fun. But we've also forgotten that 100 years ago, we basically lost most of the factories that make it, right?
Yeah, I actually like that you used the word emotional there, thinking about if and why and how we bring watchmaking back to America. So much of it has to be emotionally driven. In the beginning, let's say, I'm kind of transitioning conversation here, but we're seeing in our business that people are very inclined to purchase our watches assembled in the United States. And a huge part of that is an emotional decision to want to support a craftsman that lives close to you, that lives in the United States. And I think, in terms of bringing manufacturing back here, it is definitely more expensive and will be more expensive until we build a better, deeper infrastructure than we currently have. So what's going to drive it initially is going to have to be emotional response, because you can get a really, really fantastic case made in China for pretty affordably, and in Switzerland more affordably than you can in the United States, until we have, consumers be willing to make emotional purchases to help drive the infrastructure and recreate the infrastructure that we once had quite a long time ago. But yeah, when Switzerland and China and Japan has factories that they can just drive to and tap into that are able to make great components at scale, it definitely gives them a huge leg up.
Do you remember a couple of years ago, there was some media out there about how much it would cost to produce an iPhone if it was made in the United States? It would have been
$10,000 or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. And it's such a relevant example for this, because at the end of the day, the consumer is always looking for the best deal, right? They want to spend the lowest amount of money on the highest quality item. This is what consumers want to do. This is normal. Yet to have that American-made product, you have to be like, well, not only do you have to understand the emotional story of why Made in America is, I don't know, better, more interesting, more appealing, whatever, but you also need to set aside your consumer, reptile brain and be like, I'm going to spend a bunch times more on the same thing. And the fact remains, as you said, that getting the stuff made is an exercise in trying to find the lowest price doing it. Ryan, you mentioned how you'd love to ask the executives at brands like Omega, like how much does it cost you to make components? And that is a tightly held secret. They don't necessarily want you to know that. Look at some of the controversy which has been happening with some of the luxury brands in Europe. In Italy, for example, where things are said to be made in Italy, but what do they find? They're being made by, low-paid immigrants that aren't being paid what an Italian citizen might be paid. And this is a big scandal for these luxury brands. So all you have all over the place is, I don't want to call it a trick, but this idea of making consumers feel emotionally positive as to where they think the thing is being made, and then all these schemes to get that thing made in that place as cheaply as possible. Mm-hmm. And I think the perfect example is if you look in detail at Swiss made, how not a lot of it needs to be made in Switzerland for something to be Swiss made. And the whole reason that's so confusing is so that these companies can control costs, if you want to call it that, and deliver, a product for a lower price, because those margins, those margins are what makes the industry business. Ironically, and this is where I want your guys' opinion, consumers, this is the story they want. I want to hear if you feel differently. We're making a watch that is as good as humanly possible for the price that we're barely making any money on it. Like, they're willing to pay money up until the point where they feel like you're profiting too much, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's comedic discussions in the forums sometimes. Over the years, I've spent a ton of time in the forums, and so many people on Watch You Seek expect microbrands to be working for zero profit. They're like frustrated that there's any markup at all. Granted, Swiss luxury and a lot of these bigger conglomerate brands are marking their stuff up 10x. And most microbrand owners are like, breaking even. They're not becoming millionaires. We're not becoming millionaires, but there's this expectation and this frustration from a lot of the community that, a brand can't make too much profit, or a brand can't mark their goods up too much. And it's something that you have to navigate as a microbrand. Microbrands are basically just held to a much higher standard in terms of those things, as we should be to an extent. We want to deliver as much value to our customers as possible, but consumers definitely need to also know that for a brand to operate healthily and for a brand to be around in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years to service a watch or sell you another watch, they have to operate efficiently and make money to keep on going.
If you look at LVMH, for example, just because since you guys obviously observe the big groups, I like to bring up some of their the rules that they operate by. LVMH is interested in selling things for the highest margin possible, right? They want to produce stuff as low as possible, and they want to sell it for as much margin as possible. And what they have found out to do so, they play with the idea of what they call desirability. They believe that if they make a brand or a product desirable enough, its retail price becomes less important. That the desirability will add to the value proposition, right? So if somebody was only willing to spend, let's say, $1,000 for something before it was desirable, they will spend $5,000 on the same item. There's no extra value in it inherently, but because it's perceived as desirable, they'll spend more. So for them, that's an extra added value proposition. But they spend a lot of time and effort trying to create the desirability, and it requires a company as big as and complex as them, and they still have hiccups all the time. But it's just interesting to see that at the end of the day, it isn't actually protecting a product that is so awesome and made so cheaply. It's doing your best to convince the public at large that paying more is worth it for some ambiguous, again, emotional reason, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. That's a great assessment. And I think the emotional response is absolutely everything. You're not going to have a long-term business if you're just, as Ryan said, if you're just basically giving your watches away at near cost, because you're not then having any money left over to establish that emotional connection that comes from branding. And the luxury brand, is where it's all about. So whether luxury means USA assembly, whether that luxury means made in Italy, even if it's a Chinese person who doesn't speak Italian in Italy, working in a factory that's operated by Chinese individuals, which happens, you can buy a Gucci purse that's essentially made that way, but it's still technically made in Italy. Or a watch that's made in Switzerland by a machine. Like the System 51. It's these things are very vague as to what they actually entail in terms of the connection, but all it does is it's building a story, and those word marks can be a part of the story. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you could argue that for many people, an Apple Watch, which is, you could say, the most successful watch in the world, or Apple's the largest watch brand in the world, is a luxury product. Compared to a Rolex, it's not. It's only whatever, $400. But a lot of people have an assessment of the Apple brand as, relative like to Samsung Gear or whatever, that Apple is itself, although made in China, is an aspect of luxury, but they benefit from 40 years of incredible branding. So I think it's always an interesting path to discuss and debate. Getting back to what we were saying before about the kind of the decline of the U.S. industry, I think what is great about American brands and businesses is there's a utility to it. The McDonald's of the world, the Coca-Colas of the world, America has figured out how to create something. Levi's, another great example, where it's like for everyone. But that's what makes American brands so resonant around the world. Is they're the opposite of kind of European aristocracy and that kind of high-mindedness and class society. American brands know how to speak to everyone, and it is for everyone. Where I think that becomes trouble, particularly in the watch industry, is America made that bet. Timex made that bet. Elgin made that bet. Hamilton tried to make that bet. So they didn't innovate like following World War II and compared to their Swiss and European counterparts. And they essentially tried to go affordable. And obviously that became very problematic as quartz crisis emerged, as essentially the utility of, and as the cost of U.S. assembly increased, that the affordable part of the watch industry kind of fell through, and it required to be offshored, and they didn't have a brand left over. So it's very interesting as we sit today, and is like, we want to rebuild that. But where do we borrow from the traditions of American past of, hey, we want to build watches for everyone, like a Timex, or we also want to borrow from what the big European luxury brands are doing, like the LVMHs are doing, which is essentially establishing a sense of luxury in our business.
Ryan, any thoughts there?
No, I mean, I think Reagan laid it out pretty well. I think we're constantly trying to find the balance. I think at our core, over brand, over what those luxury brands are doing, it's providing value, providing our base set of components or a base set of features, which is a sapphire crystal, a quality movement, a stainless steel case, and 100-meter depth rating with screw down crown. That's available at $179. So our goal is to keep a base set of quality at a low price, and then offer up from there, but always ensuring that components and watch structure comes before story.
I'm happy you brought it back to Vaer, because I wanted to ask you about the emotions that you want people to feel, that you're trying to sell to. You look at the products and you're seeing what are essentially tool watches, right? And that's a very popular type of watch, but we agree that people aren't necessarily buying these watches as tools. So what are some of the emotions that you're trying to sell to, so to say?
Yeah, so I mean, we lean very, very heavily into the outdoors and durability, and we want and encourage our customers to get outside. We have what we call a waterproof warranty. So this is to sort of inspire people who may otherwise be afraid to take their $500 watch, which could be expensive for many, into the ocean because they don't want to ruin it or break it. Our waterproof warranty covers customers within our warranty period if the watch floods. So a huge piece of our marketing and branding is we want you to take your watch and get outside, go to the lake, go to the ocean, whatever it may be, beat it up and be comfortable with that. I think that's super important to us, to treat your watch as a tool. We have a ton of enthusiast community that we sell to. We also have a ton of doctors, police, military members, farmers. We get outreach from everyone across the country because we have pretty wide marketing, and we're able to reach a lot of different people who, whether they buy the watch because they're excited about the feature set and the enthusiast aspect, or they buy the watch because they need something that they can beat up working on their car or working outside. We want to appeal across that whole spectrum.
Yeah, I think like for me, one of the most resonant like emotions that I've ever seen in a brand campaign or a marketing story is like Patek Philippe's whole thing. You never own a Patek, you just hold it on to the next generation. It's like iconic. They've been running that since like the 70s or 80s, and it's worked well for them, and they just keep using that storyline, which is great. I mean, as soon as you see that and with the imagery and branding, that creates a lot of emotion for the brand, and it very much matches the story of their business. What's kind of interesting is like, is it possible to tell that story with a $200, $300, $500 watch? Is it possible to, as Ryan was saying, never sacrifice on quality? And is it possible to deliver a watch that is $500 that you could pass along to the next generation? And if that's, I mean, whether we're at that point today, that's our aspiration for our goal, because that's, I think, to me, when I see people connecting with any product, but particularly watches, it's something that maybe their grandfather passed on to them or a family member had, and it's all scratched up and beat up, but they wear it anyways. That is the type of brand that we want to build. We want people to be, hey, this is a Vaer watch, and from 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and I think a lot of microbrands share that perspective. That's what building a great brand is all about.
In terms of price point, I think it's worth talking about how Vaer is a little bit different than some of the competitors. It tends to be that your average micro brand is sort of priced in maybe this sort of close, high $600-$700 range, maybe to about $2,000 range, and it starts to sell to an enthusiast individual who's probably been reading about watches and has sort of a checklist of things. They want these materials, they want these movements and things like that. You have some of those watches, but for the most part, you've stayed, well under $500 for a lot of the watches, which is, I actually like that price point a lot, but it's a very strange one because this community that you sell to is the least, I guess you could say, at least historically, active online. Like your enthusiast that spends close to $1,000 is going to chat online and share opinions. And it's easy to understand what this person wants. But the person that spends $300 or $400 on a watch that to them is a luxury item, right? Mm-hmm. It's hard to get feedback. It's hard to know what they like. Like they do represent a large volume of people, but there's much less engagement for them to know what they like. And I just want to hear your thoughts on why you like that price point and how you study what someone spending between $200 and $400 feels or wants.
Yeah, it's honestly just been a result of development over the years. It's been an organic flow. Reagan and I are super open-minded in terms of the business. And so we started with a watch that was under $150. It was those features I listed: sapphire crystal, 100-meter depth rating, quality movement, stainless steel case. And from there, we scaled and grew into a variety of different watches. Now we have quartz, solar quartz, mecha quartz, automatic. We've had hand wind. And those have developed over the years by learning as we go. We would pick a watch style, a watch design, or a price point that we wanted ourselves, that had a feature set or a style that we enjoyed. We'd build a batch of those watches, sell them, see how the market reacted. And as we've gained consumers over time, we've been able to offer new releases to those people, but also learn from them. So like we run an annual survey that gets thousands of responses to our customers proposing a variety of watches at different styles, but price points, mixes of movements, mixes of assembly origin. We use those results to guide the business to an extent. Of course, we also take what our internal wants and needs are, and designs that we enjoy, but we really use that to help guide us into what the market wants. And then, there's been watches we've tested out, types of watches we've tested out, combinations of assembly, origin, and movement that don't work, and we just don't do that again. And we lean into what is working, which as of lately has been our US assembled watches with solar powered movements. That's kind of the sweet spot we found, and those retail right around $400. They start at $299 and $400 with different band options. But we basically, over the last 8 years, been able to adapt and follow what's working, lean more heavily into what's working, and test new things to see if those work as well.
Yeah, and also I think, as Ryan was kind of suggesting, it does go back to kind of our own personal story. We started Vaer in our mid-20s. I think we started the whole business with $30,000. That was our first batch of watches. So yeah, just what we chose and what we could afford and what we could build. There are obviously other brands doing startups in quartz, but often, at least kind of at that time, the 2015, 2016 period, it was mostly people who were thinking fashion watches or high margin, cheap component cost. and spend a lot on Instagram influencers or something like that. And instead, we spent a year just trying to water test watches to make sure they wouldn't flood while we surfed. So we had this kind of weird blend of a kind of a micro brand requirements list, but that doing it for, a fashion watch price point. So that was kind of an odd anomaly. And again, I wouldn't say that was like a wise business decision, because it creates that's a lot of issues of trying to grow with having not a lot of margin left over for your product. But it ultimately, as you kind of analyzed, it creates this unique niche for us in the market. And I think today, obviously, we've grown, the business has grown, the lineup has grown. But I think it's very important. We always want to think of that version of ourselves as that person who can't afford even a $200 watch is a big spend, and we want that $200 watch better last for 5 years and better have no problems. That's the type of customer that we want to continuously think about. And they may be in their 70s just as likely as they're in their 20s, but it's just kind of referencing that those people are out there and we can build products for them.
This question might be a little bit difficult, but I'm really curious about it, and has to do with what I call the importance of overall design. My guess, and I could be wrong, is that only a small number of consumers, like myself and other enthusiasts, are ultimately really concerned about the specific design. My guess is that most consumers want the right list of specs, the right sort of reassurances, if you will, the right price point, and overall the right story. But the precise watch that they buy could look this way or that way. And it's only a relatively small number of serious nerds that are like, I would buy it, but the hands are the wrong, shape or something like that. Mm-hmm. Do you have any feedback on how, I'll call it design versus emotion sensitive your customers are?
Yeah, I would say the bulk of our customers are very pleased they're less design focused, I should say. We spend a lot of time on design. Reagan is a fantastic designer. And we definitely see those customers who are like, if the hands were just this way, or if the print on the dial was slightly adjusted, or, the way the date's truncated, all these tiny little details, that's, 1 to 5% of consumers. The bulk of people.
That little.
Yeah, I would say, those people who are really, really focused on the granular details, it's a small segment. And even still, maybe not 1 to 5%, I don't know, I'm totally estimating. But even of those people, they'll still purchase the watch if they see it as the right combination of, package and brand story and price point. So we have plenty of people who will send us feedback and say, I'm still buying the watch, but I would love to see this changed. There's enough in selling a watch with a great value combination of features with a great overall aesthetic, even if there's tiny details that certain people want. So, in those surveys we do, we'll get 3,000 or 4,000 responses, and we'll have 1,000 free form requests and comments from people that we go through, and those have so many little details. Everybody has their own specific preference on the tone of old radium lume. Of course, date no date is always a huge one. I want to see this with date or no date.
And
I was going
to interrupt on that one. Exactly. We were debating ourselves, should it be date or no date? And we're like, we got to ask the community, let the community decide. And it was literally 50% wanted date and 50% wanted no date. So we're like, what do we do with that information? So you're always going to be disappointing half the population, basically. So
yeah. But, sorry, just to complete it, there is a magic in, some of our best designs that no one really has any critique on. You get to a point where there's a certain watch we have, and it pleases the people who are into that style are completely pleased by it. They don't have feedback. They don't have requests. And then there's other designs where it's just a constant tinkering, or there might be a slight imbalance or whatever it may be. But those types of people you're talking about, definitely we've seen them in, Watch Crunch, Watch You Seek, Reddit. And we love to have conversations with them. You can't please everybody, but I think it's a pretty small segment of people, and then even smaller segment of people who have those opinions and won't purchase the watch. They'll generally be able to, get past it and still pick it up, but they'll let us know. They like to let us know.
I'm always go ahead.
I was just going to say another point on kind of where we try to center our designs is because, again, it's any time you're operating a business, there's risk. A watch business, there's essentially even more risk because it's kind of a low margin operation. But one way we've tried to anchor our business to have a little bit of stability or safety is the thing that I think of is if this watch existed in the 1960s, would it fit in? Would it make sense if I sent it back in time, and does it adhere to what we would call classical proportions? And if it does, okay, first of all, it's going to be too boring to, the vast majority of the enthusiast community, because they're going to be like, where's the pops of color? Where's this? There's that. Where's the meteorite dial? But in reality, like, okay, we may get to there at some point, but let's nail the basics. Let's ensure that you have your black dial dive watch before you have your pink and whatever dive watch. So it's just a matter of like kind of walking before you're running. And that's kind of the way we think about it. And making that historical reference creates a safe space, but a place that we think, again, we have that ambition of our watches lasting decades. And I think when you look back to decades and say, hey, that was stylish then, we appreciate design now, that hopefully it will carry forward in the future.
I wanted to sort of close this topic by showing that even the biggest established brands never seem to be able to figure out when a watch design is like done or perfect. They're constantly taking their hits and they're tweaking them, different colors, different this or that, dials is popular, different sizes. If Rolex is doing it, can't seem to figure out the sweet spot, that means maybe there is no sweet spot and that it's just what consumers want is the constant fluctuation. It's like they want 50% novelty and 50%, familiarity. And what that means to an individual is hard to understand. I think it's interesting that when you polled your audience for some questions like the date, no date, it's split down the middle. And what a lot of brands have done is take the same model and there's a date version, there's a no date version. I've seen that multiple times. I don't know how well that works out. But it is a moving target. And I think the biggest challenge, if I were in your shoes or that of any watch brand, manager, it's what to do next. Always very difficult to decide what to do next. Because, 50 years ago, the market would be like, yeah, they need a chronograph for this activity. It needed to be this size. It needs to be this durability. And then you're like, okay, I have what I call parameters. I know what the tool needs to do. What it looks like is less important than does the tool, meet the requirements of the task. Mm-hmm. These days, it's just this giant sandbox of do I make something old? Do I make something new? What size? What materials? Whose opinion do I trust? Is it mine? Do I ask 100 people in the community to see what they want? There's all these ways of getting information, inspiration, but ultimately deciding what to make is something that an entrepreneur has no better understanding of what to do than one of these Swiss brand managers. You have instincts, you have experience, but ultimately trying new things is the only way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ryan touched on it, but essentially, like, we still basically build watches, like, as watch nerds, like, build watches that we want to wear. That's by far the easiest methodology. So that, and I think that's the benefit of being a small
build
company.
What you want to wear personally, you mean?
100%. Yeah, exactly. That's that. I mean, there are watches in the lineup, but this is where you get to a certain stage, is you get there watches in the lineup that neither Ryan and I wear. As an example, like we both have small wrists, so I tend towards our 36. I'm wearing a 36 millimeter watch. I rarely wear our 40 mil field watches, but that's just mostly. I love the vintage aesthetic. The smaller, the better from my perspective. Again, I wouldn't say that's a good business model because most men want bigger watches, but I personally like the small watches, so I gravitate towards that. But on top of that, yes, like, we trend small because that's what we personally like. And we want to be excited. We both love seeing prototypes. We love wearing it on the first day and being like, wow, this really turned out well.
Let's talk about the American assembly part. I think it's not surprising at all that a lot of consumers respond well to that. People all over the world tend to like the idea of buying, we'll just call it local, whatever that means. So it doesn't surprise me that that's been successful for you. Practically speaking, how does that work? I know that there's a section on your website called USA Assembly, and you have a map with a number of different places. But practically speaking, what is done in America, and how do you and who do you work with?
Yeah, so we've worked in a variety of methods over the years, but our current layout is basically working with different assemblers across the United States. So we've built relationships with assembly operations and teams and individuals in LA, Arizona, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and expanding. And we've gotten in touch with these people. We've worked with them, some of them through service, some of them through just getting in touch with through friends of friends. But essentially, we're able to take kits of our watches and send a kit batch to these technicians and have them produced. So, you could be buying a Vaer watch that's produced in any one of these places in the United States.
That's a crucial element. The parts are made. But then to make a product look good, you need to have it assembled by a professional. And that not only ensures that the thing works, but also that you can have high confidence, because making parts properly is a completely separate task than assembly. Would you say that there's a lot of trial and error, meaning there's a lot of like bad assemblers, or there's just a few small number of good ones in the US and you just have to find out who they are? You're laughing, like maybe there's a lot of terrible ones.
We've dealt with that in the, we've gone through, we work with, five or six now. We've gone through, I want to say tens over the years with small batches of watches. It's very challenging. There's a ton of watch technicians in the United States. There's a ton of watchmakers in the United States. And we've, gone through, a variety of tests trying to find the right people with the right quality. At the center, at our hub is QC. So we take the components into QC here in Venice. We distribute the components, and then we take the finished watches back to Venice for QC again to make sure everything's good. And so, over the years, we've vetted these technicians and technician teams we work with to ensure, that everything's done to a high degree of precision and quality. But we've had our fair share of getting a batch of 50 watches back and being like, what in the world happened here? Then we have to go through a rebuild or replacing all the components or whatever it may be. So it hasn't been easy per se, but there's a lot of talented watch technicians and watchmakers in the US.
The other point, Ariel, is like you were kind of alluding that like watch enthusiasts have a lot of strong opinions. Like, getting in conversations with watch technicians, like they have a lot of opinions about how you can make the kit better or why your manufacturing is wrong. And so it is very funny. Ryan and I are essentially the middle managers and trying to say, well, hey, but and that's actually the kind of the hidden value of it, though. It as much as we have to take all of their feedback with a grain of salt, because they ultimately want to make their lives as easy as possible so they can make as much money as possible. These people, many of them are, lifelong technicians in their 50s and 60s. They do know watches. And so they can identify, say, things like pinion heights or clearance issues or things that for Ryan and I, we are not technically, like are not master watch technicians ourselves. So to have someone locally in LA, in the San Fernando Valley, as an example, who we can go to and have a coffee with, and they can tell us for an hour everything wrong about our watch design and mark up our technical drawings. That like you were saying about how the Swiss have that benefit. This is where we may see a benefit as we continue to grow the business, is having that insight from those people who really know what they're talking about.
I think it's so valuable for people to know that that's how these watches come to be, that there isn't some, all-in-one factory in China where you just send them a drawing and then they industrialize it and they do prototypes and they build it to high quality and then they just sort of send a final product and you're just sitting there doing marketing or something like that. Some people believe that. And there might be other industries where that's, and that has happened in the watch space before. The watches have not been great as a result, but people have tried that. We'll call it the drop shipping method, if you want to say it, so in a sense. But to get it right, even at low price points, require all the checks that you're talking about. Quality control, as you said, is not just a one-time, let's check it before it goes out, but there's multiple phases. And you go to the watch factories, for example, and every time they order parts from a supplier, even if it's someone that they've done business for a long time, they have to check the parts, sometimes one at a time or sometimes just samples of the batches. But because you're always needed to make sure that everything works, hundreds of little things need to go right for one watch to sort of fit together. And I think that's maybe not a hidden value, but maybe a value that a lot of people aren't aware of. And there's too much misunderstanding out there of sort of how easy it is to put these things together. So for the end of our conversation, I want to talk about marketing, because I think that's something that you guys do very well. And my understanding is that prior to being into watches, you guys had experience with, we'll call it modern forms of marketing. Is that right?
Yeah, we worked in a tech startup together that was local marketing. And, there we learned email marketing together, just digital marketing in general.
What were some of the most valuable things you learned that when you incorporate it in the watch space, you're like, oh, this works. I can get a brand off the ground because I have these skills on how to use, we'll call them online advertising tools?
That's a great question. I would
probably say, I think email is a foundation. That's probably the one thing. And if you're a watch brand and you're not like capturing customers' emails, then you should be. It's kind of this idea of, the common term D2C, direct to consumer, essentially like in the old way of doing things, which is the wholesale thing, is like you don't really know who your customers are and you're not controlling the communication with that customer. So what you essentially want to do in a modern context, and obviously social, and there are other channels, ways of communicating through forums and otherwise, but email is kind of the backbone of that, I think, for most modern brands. So you're essentially trying to, even for customers who have not yet purchased a watch, but have got to your site, have browsed, have some interest, trying to get everything you can to get that email allows you to keep that conversation going in a digital context. Obviously, in olden days, you would essentially they would walk into your store and you would have a conversation that way. But in this context, you can't do that. So you use email to essentially maintain that ongoing chat. And then the other thing that we've continued to do is expand the different formats of email. And one of the things we found a lot of success with, as an example, is doing like long form written, like founders updates. And that's just a kind of the accentuation of what is possible with email, is allowing people to really feel like they're connecting with not just a brand, but with two guys who are running the company.
You also do mailers and what I'll call in the real world stuff, not just digital things. Talk about some of the physical forms of marketing you do. I spoke to a member of the aBlogtoWatch team here who lives also in LA, and he's like, yeah, I totally see their mailers and maybe some other things like that, which was great. It means the system works. But talk a little bit about some of these things you do, because I think it's interesting insofar that most of the brands don't. A lot of brands, they stick just to online marketing, and they forget that there needs to be a more expansive, I think I'll call it scope of what marketing should entail.
Yeah, I think like 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it felt like, and I believed that it was all digital. Brick and mortar is done and print is done and everything's going the way of digital. And I think in the last few years, we felt a pretty major shift back towards analog. People want to see and feel and touch things. Brick and mortar is doing well again. We've leaned heavily into catalogs. People being able to get a print catalog and look at the watches on a piece of paper has worked really, really well for us. It gives people a physical connection to something they're otherwise shopping completely digitally. And I honestly, I think it's that sort of shift from digital to analog is a really, really beautiful thing for the world of horology, because in a world where people are like, why would you need a watch when you just have a cell phone? There's this like want and need and feel for people to get back to the physical, to get back to something that's, mechanical on their wrist, and not be so constantly in the digital world looking at a screen, and you don't need to use your phone constantly to check the time. You can look down at your wrist. And, in the same vein, not all marketing has to be on a screen all the time. Getting in front of people's eyes in the physical world is super impactful. And, circling back to the beginning of the conversation, these watch fairs are such a good way to, talk to people in person. But yeah, print and catalogs has been a really, really big unlock for us, and something that our consumers just appreciate. They have even if they don't own a watch, people are like, I got your catalog and I really enjoyed it, and I'll buy a watch eventually.
I was just going to make the point on physical retail. We would love to. And I think I'm very excited, not just for Vaer to get to that point, but for other micro brands to start to have showrooms. And I think, as much as we always get asked that when we go to the watch fairs, I think consumers just need to understand, like, we don't not like flush with cash. We're not like highly profitable. So it's just one of those things. Digital allows us to have that control, but we also understand that when we can get there, we believe, as I'm sure you could agree, is like going and seeing those watches in person, whatever the brand is, that really starts to communicate the value of the product. It's just a slow path to get there, because especially in a city like LA or New York, doing physical retail is a huge investment and a huge risk. And we want to do it well, because we want it to reflect our brand values. But it's just something that we really are excited to get to at some point.
I want to actually talk about that as maybe our last topic here, because I think it's interesting. Historically, you had big brand retailers, your department stores and your various types of locations that if you sold your watches there, you do pretty well. And I remember interesting examples like Sharper Image, for example, that did really well for like a Luminox. And there's lots of examples of how a good retail partner can really make a brand. These days, if you're in a Vaer position, there's not a lot of options, okay? The Macy's of the world have other problems, right? Mm-hmm. They sell watches, but I wouldn't call it a growth center. You're not going to be like, Macy's picked us up, we're going to do great. That's not a thing. Your sort of specialty shops where people buy watches, sporting goods, and things like that, they exist, but they're not pushing watches in the sense that they're making new stuff. Like if someone's already going there looking for your brand, maybe they'll find it, but they're not going to create giant markets for you. Starting your own store, as you said, is an expensive endeavor. Being in a traditional watch store environment is really only for high margin brands where a salesperson is going to be excited about spending time with the consumer and making a few hundred or a few $1,000 as a commission. There is a deficiency out there of good real world places to sell. And I want to ask you, what would the ideal, and again, practically speaking, type of retail partner look like? Are there types of businesses that you're hopeful? Are you waiting for something like that to go up there? Because again, I think that the larger context is that any watch brand today has to fruitfully mix digital and in-person marketing. How they do the in-person is going to vary on brand, just like online. But having retail partners, I think is a great thing for the brands that should not or do not want to go direct to consumer all the time. We only have a few seconds left here, but share your thoughts on these, complicated but important topics.
Yeah, I personally think for us, the stores we've seen the best success on are men's boutiques. So kind of a generalist store that may sell denim and boots and watches, somewhere that has a bit more variety to it, not a traditional huge store. Boutiques are also great because you do get passionate store members. The stores we've sold well in, the few stores we've sold well in, have people at the stores who actually owned a Vaer watch, and we got in touch with them because they loved their watch and wanted to sell it. And so they're in there, it's a smaller team in a smaller store. And when they're having conversations with people who come in to purchase things, they can tell them from a place of personal passion, oh, you need to check this watch out. And I think getting an army of people who are passionate about what they're selling is really, really key to success in brick and mortar.
Yeah, the other piece of the dream as well, obviously it pairs well with the USA assembly component, but we always love, like, you go into a restaurant, you see the open kitchen of the food being prepped. If we had the infinite financial resources, we would love to basically have retail space where you could watch assembly in the basically front of the house, back of the house, but with like a window, and that kind of connects. And in my opinion, retail needs to be experiential in order to draw people in. Either that's a connection with that shopkeeper or a connection with the space, and it's something to kind of tell a story. And I think for us, we want to do it well. And if we could match brick and mortar retail with also showcasing what USA Assembly is all about, then I think it would be a perfect fit.
Finally, this is just an opportunity for you guys to let anyone know about additional places they can learn about you online. Obviously, there's the Vaer website, but go ahead and just plug away at whatever you want people to see.
Yeah. First off, thank you so much for your time. But yeah, you can check us out at VaerWatches.com. We have a pretty great website with a ton of information on our manufacturing, our supply chain. We share a ton of really interesting adventure stories where our watches are being used in those outdoor environments. We want people to be inspired to go visit and see. And then we also have a YouTube channel. So if you search Vaer Watches, you can find us. And we have a lot of interesting films. We have videos and information to try to inspire passion in horology about the watches, about components, about supply chain, whatever it may be.
Yeah, just as Ryan said, it's a very transparent. So if you listen to this conversation and want to know more, what does USA Assembly actually mean or entail, you can go to our website and find, we have blog articles, we have landing pages kind of detailing every step and stage, every component. And for some watch nerds, maybe that's worthwhile reading.
Thank you, guys. This has been the Superlative Podcast interview with Ryan Torres and Reagan Cook of Vaer Watches. Ryan and Reagan, thank you so much.
Thank you
so much.
It was a pleasure.